Hi, this is History with Andrew Allen, and this is my series, The Emergence of Europe, the Fall of the Roman Empire, the Rise of the Franks, and the creation of Charlemagne's Empire. Today is episode 14, The End of the Ostrogoth Kingdom. Before I forget, I include the names of the people I talk about and my sources in the description. As I explained last episode, Justinian gambled on an invasion of North Africa after the Nika riots. When the Vandal kingdom fell surprisingly quickly, Justinian captured Sicily as a base for the conquest of Italy. The Ostrogoths proved to be more difficult than the Vandals, so General Belisarius moved slowly, taking one city at a time. The war lasted for several years, but the Ostrogoth king finally surrendered. Great. Justinian could call himself Emperor of the Roman Empire. Except the newly reunited empire soon faced a crisis. Since much of the imperial army was far away in Italy, the Shah of Persia sacked Antioch, one of the greatest cities in the empire. In a bit of unfortunate timing, Belisarius had returned to the capital with Witiges and other leading Goths for a celebration. Well, it would not be a celebration for Witiges, he would be the entertainment. However, the celebrations were cancelled. Instead, Belisarius was sent off to Syria with as many troops as could be gathered, which was not many since the main Roman army was still in Italy. Belisarius did what he could and launched several raids on Persian territory in the spring of 541, but they were poor compensation for the fall of Antioch. Aside from the surprise Persian capture of Antioch in 540, Justinian's empire suffered natural catastrophes. Contemporary records discuss a sudden drop in temperature and never-ending clouds that were probably caused by a series of volcanic eruptions from 536 to 540 across the world from Central America to Iceland. Less sun obviously resulted in poor harvests and weakened immune systems due to reduced vitamin D. Around the same time, bubonic plague rampaged through hungry, weakened people. Obviously, a detailed examination of the cause of the plague from the period does not exist, but the widespread famine may have forced rodents to ignore the danger of close proximity to humans, and the fleas who carried the plague started to feed on humans. Either their rat hosts had died, or they were not picky, so they fed on the nearest host. The plague seems to have first appeared in the summer of 541 in Egypt, and the empire's excellent logistics system ensured that it spread rapidly. Doctors had no idea how to treat this new disease, which killed thousands a day at its peak. Despite the empire's impressive bureaucracy, the dead numbered too many to accurately count, so all that we really know is that a fatal disease rampaged through the Eastern Roman Empire. Aside from the tragedy of the massive death toll, the economy took a hard hit, which led to greatly reduced tax revenue, which made it harder to pay for armies. In the end, Justinian brought peace in Syria in 545, but the Persians continued to advance in the region. Actually, the empire had other problems. Obviously, Justinian was happy to learn that the Vandal kingdom had fallen so easily. However, he suddenly faced the challenge of how to administer the newest province of the Eastern Roman Empire. The new system was announced in April 534. North Africa would be administered by its own Praetorian prefect, who would report directly to Constantinople. Recognizing that North Africa was too large for a single governor, it was divided into 7 separate provinces, each with its own governor under the prefect. Great. Now all that was required was to collect the taxes. Well, there was also a religious issue to settle. The Homoian or Arian church had thrived in the Vandal kingdom, although it had never entirely replaced the original Nicene church. Hoping to avoid unnecessary religious conflict, the Arian bishops would be permitted to remain bishops if they simply adopted the Nicene Creed. Unfortunately, this praiseworthy toleration was not shared by the Nicene bishops. The Nicene Church had endured decades of alternating persecution and neglect depending on who was king. So, the surviving Nicene bishops had zero interest in toleration. In 535, a council announced a complete ban on Arian church services. This decision was supported by the Patriarch of Rome, and since the Arian Church was associated with the former regime, Justinian concluded that it would be simpler to just support the Nicene churches. Except, roughly 1,000 troops in the imperial garrison followed the Arian church, and they resented the closure of their churches. Worse, the soldiers were already cranky because their pay was not up to date. The explanation for the pay problem was simple. An invasion of Italy was expensive, so it had received priority, and the troops of the garrison were expected to be patient. If the posting had been peaceful, they might have been patient, but the Berber nomads had not stopped raiding the region simply because there was a change in management. Remember, Hilderic had been overthrown because he had failed to stop Berber raids. Berber chieftains had presented themselves to Belisarius, inquiring about his views on maintaining the previous regime's policy of gifts, basically small, regular payments to avoid raids. Belisarius had a large army and ignored them. When that army left for Italy, the Berbers' negotiating position improved, but the new administration lacked money. Attempts to discipline the Berbers had mixed results since nomads are difficult to permanently contain. Anyway, the soldiers were grumbling about risking their lives for no pay, and they could not even worship in their own churches. The simmering resentment boiled over right after Easter 536. The prefect escaped with a small entourage to Sicily, but the soldiers killed many officers. The revolt finally ended following the arrival of the emperor's cousin Germanus in 537 with a lot of gold. Troops were allowed to return, no questions asked, and received their long overdue pay. Still, not the best start to the Eastern Roman Empire's occupation of North Africa. Well, at least the newly conquered Italy was calm. Actually, the situation in Italy was less stable than it appeared. Admittedly, the Goths had been unable to defeat Belisarius' army, but they did not welcome their new occupiers. Reinforcements and a careful policy of rewards might have pacified the Goths, but neither was available. In theory, the Goths would choose a new leader and restore control over Italy, but this proved difficult. The two main claimants took the competition to succeed Witigis very seriously, and both of them were dead by the end of 541. A Goth named Totila ended up on top, but the Goths were far from united. Still, Totila had a key advantage. Constantinople was occupied with a Persian invasion and a rapidly spreading epidemic, so it could not supply the garrisons in Italy. After Totila had won several victories, the imperial troops realized that they were unlikely to be paid, but they were increasingly likely to be defeated sooner or later. Since they were often allied barbarians, hired rather than recruited, their loyalty depended on the regular payment of their salaries, so many of them simply joined the Goths. The imperial commander saw the danger and went on the offensive. However, many troops simply did not want to fight, so Totila won a major victory in early 542, which naturally attracted more Goths to follow him. Another victory near Florence put the Imperials on the defensive, and Totila moved south, taking Naples in the spring of 543. Since Naples was the key port on the supply chain from Sicily to Rome, its surrender enabled Totila to concentrate on Rome, and it seemed that the Goths were on the verge of regaining control over Italy. Even Rome surrendered after a year-long siege. The records are not clear, but Totila managed to collect enough tax revenue to pay his army, so large parts of Italy were safe. Basically, the question was whether the functional regions of Italy would provide enough tax revenue to hold off the empire until it abandoned the struggle in order to concentrate on its borders. Totila was able to gain control of Italy, partially because the empire had failed to win any support among the inhabitants of Italy. Much of the imperial army was made up of barbarian groups working for Constantinople, and the commanders, administrators, and tax collectors were Greeks. However, the campaigns had strained the Goth army, so Totila handed over Venetia to the Frankish king Theodebert because he needed the men of its garrison, while Witigis had handed over Provence to the Franks because he could not defend territory on the other side of the Alps. Totila gave the region around Venetia to Theodebert in the hope that the Franks would block an imperial army marching from Dalmatia. By this time, Belisarius had returned, but he brought few troops. Still, he retook Rome in April 547, but that was his limit, and he was recalled to Constantinople in 548. Totila besieged Rome again from the summer of 549 until it fell in January. Although Totila had regained most of the kingdom, he knew that Constantinople would eventually focus its full power on Italy, so he sent several embassies offering concessions to gain peace. However, Justinian was unwilling to accept the loss of prestige, and the war on the Eastern Front had stabilized. Justinian did not have many troops to spare, but he had a lot of gold, and he had his effective cousin, Germanus. The gold was employed to recruit men in Dalmatia to supplement the small force of regulars. Germanus was a good choice for commander since he had married Witiges' widow, Matasuentha, demonstrating a desire to reassure the Goths that they would be well treated if they surrendered. In fact, Matasuentha soon became pregnant. Admittedly, it quite likely was a loveless marriage, but Germanus had married into the royal family in order to improve his reception as the new governor of Italy. Moreover, he had gained a good reputation in North Africa, so soldiers who had joined the Goths for steady pay knew that they could return to the Roman army without fear of punishment. Totila was undoubtedly aware of all of this, so he must have breathed a sigh of relief when he learned that Germanus had died near the end of 550. Actually, it is a good question whether Totila should have welcomed the death of Germanus, since Germanus was known for dealing fairly with conquered regions. By the way, as the emperor's cousin and trusted advisor, Germanus would have possibly inherited the throne when Justinian died, but he died first and was replaced by Narses. An eunuch, Narses appeared an odd choice, but he had remained loyal during the Nika riots and he was an effective general. Honestly, no disrespect to Narses, his ability did not really matter. Germanus had started the organization of an army, and Justinian supplied enough money to recruit more than 5,000 Lombards, 3,000 members of the Heruli tribe, and thousands of regular troops. While the size of the army was daunting, it also sent a message. Justinian had zero interest in negotiation and would never give up until he had conquered Italy. Totila and his advisors may have wondered how Justinian could continue to finance the war, but the citizens of the empire seemed willing to bear the crushing tax burden, at least long enough to grind the Gothic kingdoms into dust. Totila and his advisors may have wondered how Justinian could continue to finance the war, but the citizens of the empire seemed willing to bear the crushing tax burden, at least long enough to grind the Gothic kingdom into dust. So Totila had to win. Meanwhile, Narses had prepared carefully and only started his campaign in April 552. The Franks lived up to the bargain and blocked his advance, although they were probably motivated by the desire to protect their new territory. Rather than fight the Franks, Narses marched along the coast using ships to bridge the mouths of rivers. He finally encountered Totila's army at Tadine, roughly halfway between Ravenna and Rome, in late June. The Goths were crushed, and Totila died. Totila was succeeded by his general Taius, but he died in battle a few months later, at which point most of the remaining Goths surrendered. Some fought on, but even with the aid of a Frankish army, they were defeated, and the last Gothic resistance had been broken by November 562. The Ostrogoths had controlled Italy for roughly 3 generations. The war for Italy had lasted a generation and had destroyed the Ostrogoth elite. Just a quick recap. Taius had succeeded Totila, who had succeeded Witiges, who had succeeded Theodahad, along with numerous contenders who died before they could gain power. The war had also left large areas of Italy in ruins, so a shocking amount of destruction and loss of life for little benefit. To be fair, North Africa and Sicily were taken at relatively little cost. In the end, Justinian received glory and the knowledge that both the Vandals in North Africa and the Ostrogoths in Italy had been eliminated as rivals. In theory, trade would recover and produce more tax revenue, but it would take time. Moreover, it was far from guaranteed that Constantinople could afford to maintain garrisons in the new regions. Oops, I almost forgot. The empire had even taken part of Hispania. Back when Germanus was raising an army, a fleet had been sent to recapture Sicily from the Goths. That fleet included Liberius, a former Roman aristocrat who had impressed Theodoric and had been appointed governor of Provence. As a result, when Theodahad had needed an envoy to the emperor to explain the imprisonment of his cousin Amalasuentha, he had chosen Liberius. However, Liberius was clearly unimpressed with Theodahad since he chose to remain in Constantinople. When Narses was sent with a large army to defeat Totila, a smaller army was taken from Narses and sent with Liberius to Hispania to help Athanagild, who had revolted against King Agila, even though they were related. Wait, who was Agila? First, I need to discuss the previous decade in Hispania. A few years after the Franks had obtained Provence from Witiges, they turned their attention to Septimania. A brief geography lesson is required to explain Septimania. The Pyrenees were a natural obstacle between Frankish-controlled Aquitaine and Visigoth-controlled Hispania, but there were two main entry points, so the Visigoths strengthened them. Nîmes guarded the gap between the Pyrenees and the Cevennes range, while Carcassonne guarded the narrow coastline between the Massif Central, the highland region that dominates southeastern France, and the Mediterranean. The area became known as Septimania, although it later became known as the Languedoc. There were undoubtedly a number of raids on the region, but the next major invasion occurred in 541 when Childebert and his brother Clothar marched across the Pyrenees, but the invasion was a failure. According to Gregory of Tours, they had retreated because they saw the tunic of Saint Vincent on the walls of Saragossa. It is a nice story, but none of the Frankish kings had ever demonstrated much piety, so this seems to have been a face-saving gesture after a defeat, or a recognition that the town had strong walls. Clearly, the kings themselves did not have any desire to make another attempt, since they never tried again. Theodos was king, but he was not a young man, so his army had been led by Theodegizel. Although he was the son of Theodahad, Theodoric's nephew, he was one of the Ostrogoths who had chosen to remain in Hispania when the Greater Gothic kingdom had broken apart following Theodoric's death. When Theodos was killed by an angry servant in 548, Theodegizel succeeded him as king, but he did not have the full support of the nobles, so he was assassinated less than 2 years later. A noble named Agila made himself king, but the new king soon found himself facing several revolts. One of those revolts was led by Athanagild, who made an arrangement with the empire. The small imperial force tipped the balance in the civil war, and Athanagild became king in 555 after Agila had been murdered by his followers. While Athanagild was undoubtedly happy to sit on the throne, the imperial force had not been sent out of kindness. The new king agreed to let the empire keep a stretch of the eastern coastline, and the Balearic Islands, which combined with Corsica and Sardinia, gave the empire firm control over part of the western Mediterranean. To sum up, Justinian had conquered much of the former Western Roman Empire, but he soon had to deal with a surprise Persian invasion in the east and a widespread epidemic. Since the empire was busy on the eastern front, the surviving Goths attempted to regain control of Italy, but they failed to drive out the imperial army. Moreover, Justinian was determined to gain control of Italy, so he funded a huge army that gradually conquered Italy, and the last Gothic resistance had been crushed by 562. The war for Italy had lasted a generation and had destroyed the Ostrogoth elite. In addition, the empire intervened in a civil war in Visigoth Hispania and received part of the eastern coastline, so Justinian had come close to restoring the Roman Empire. However, imperial control of Italy was soon challenged by a new group of barbarians, the Lombards, and I will discuss their invasion of Italy next episode. Thanks for listening. If you liked the episode and want to support me, I include a link to my Patreon in the description. Or you can buy me a coffee.